Our next speaker is Dr. Michael Lesk. Dr. Michael Lesk began in digital text processing in 1961, working for Jerry Salton. After years at Bell Labs, Bell Corps, and the NSF, he's now teaching at Rutgers. Dr. Lesk's talk is on NSF and digital libraries. Michael?
Thank you. So it's a truism today that more data beats better algorithms, hailing Norvig and Pereira. But even in the 1960s, we knew that we needed more data and content for information retrieval. Back in the 60s, everybody had their little bit of text. I can remember carefully keystroking one Supreme Court decision. One of my colleagues had a small set of Icelandic saga. And the attempts, however, to build large corpora ran into trouble with funding, technology, and I'm sad to say jealousy. I can actually remember around 1970, a fairly coherent project to do the major works of English and American literature. And this is before the internet, so it had to be single site. And it was going to be Poughkeepsie, with IBM doing the technology, Vassar doing the English literature specialty, NSF providing the money. And it didn't happen because some people at Berkeley showed up and said, why should Vassar do this? We want to do this. And NSF said, go settle your problems and come back. Other problems, other projects that ran into issues, the Oxford Text Archive, which was a very nice start, didn't have the money to do anything systematically, didn't always keep the best records. I still remember writing them and saying, you have the following story in the archive. Any idea who wrote it? And then Project Gutenberg, also a very ambitious plan. The late Michael Hart, unfortunately, was a bit prickly and kept having fights with the people he needed for support. Well, things staggered along for a while. In 1991, at the SIGIR conference, Maria Zamankova said, look, there are other sciences that do this better. Astronomy produces a 10-year plan. The database community has regular meetings then at Asilomar to come up with a plan. And in fact, I once asked one of the leading astronomers, Alex Saleh, how do you keep these people from stabbing each other in the back the way the computer science is doing? You do a 10-year plan and every astronomer agrees with it. Nobody starts saying, oh, you've written that telescope down for Texas and we want it in Arizona. Well, all Alex could say to me was, there are only a few astronomers. We all know each other and we get along. Anyway, Maria asked for a plan. Mike McGill, Ed Fox, and I said, well, why don't we set a goal of digitizing all the works needed for an undergraduate degree in any science? We didn't understand the copyright issues. We thought, well, there'll be some textbook we'll be able to use, without understanding that textbooks are about the most lucrative books that any publisher has. Furthermore, there was a practical problem. We priced it out. It was much too big for Maria, who was simply one program officer. Fortunately, YT Chen, who was the division director, liked the idea, and it was the right budget size for him. So we got the digital library project, and I should say, since Ron mentioned this, we were told that the reason electronic libraries became digital libraries was that the Clinton administration wanted a new name for what they were doing. Now, the result of this, the DLI-1 project, funded 6 projects, and they were CMU, University of Michigan, Illinois, Berkeley, Stanford, and Santa Barbara. And they each had their turf. CMU took video, Michigan took metadata, Illinois took converting XML to HTML, honest. Berkeley had environmental stuff. Stanford did interoperability, and UCSB did geography. Now, some of these got overrun by larger industrial efforts. I mean, the publishers figured out how to do XML to HTML if they wanted to. And obviously, video, there were people with much larger money, much larger pots of money doing digital video than CMU. But the Stanford project, which I confess I didn't like at the time because it was the only one of the projects that didn't have a specific test collection. The Stanford project produced Google. So in hindsight, it's probably the most important thing NSF funded that decade. 10 years later, we did the second DLI with more of an effort to get libraries into it and a wider range of materials going way into the humanities. DARPA remained as a co-funder. NASA dropped out because the reporting structure that NSF likes isn't rigid enough for NASA. We gained IMLS, NLM, NEH, and even the FBI as agencies putting in a little money. We had paleontology at Texas, patient records at Columbia, speech at Michigan State, and many others. And that produced some things we still have, like the Harvard Dataverse and the Perseus project. But we were missing depth. We kept getting complaints from research. Well, you have this literary text, but you don't have the commentary. We need all this other stuff. We need a bigger project. There were efforts to do, another, for example, comprehensive effort was let's do all of the 18th century newspapers. And there again, where are the commentaries? And unfortunately, the people who had the best collection of 18th century American newspapers said, oh, we think we can sell this to SoftBank. We don't think, Newsbank, we don't see why we should let you scan them for free. This was a mistake made several times where we would think that if publishers weren't getting any money out of something, they'd be willing to let us have it. And that just didn't happen. There were sayings in the early days of the internet that people would be working together for a while before they discovered each side expected the other one to pay that. And people didn't understand why some things would work and others wouldn't. I don't know if any of you remember the Rocket ebook, which was a year 2000 project to sell a small handheld device on which you could read books, and it died. And about 7 years later, the Amazon Kindle, which looks roughly the same, was a big success. Depends on who you talk to, why. There are people who tell you it has to do with the screen quality. Because I'm a content person, I tell you it has to do with the amount of material available and what it was. But it's quite possible it was just out of time. I was wandering around the Rutgers Library stacks 2 or 3 years ago, and I discovered that in the 1930s, somebody had anticipated collaborative filtering. That's the name for other people who read this book, also read this other book, why don't you buy it? And someone had published a table in the 1930s of people who read Dickens also read Jane Austen or whatever. And it dropped without a stone. It was the wrong time. So that happens. Other problems have to do with the question of how defensive the different industries are. The publishers, I may complain, but they're decent people compared with the music industry. Google Books actually reached a tentative settlement with the publishing industry in 2005. And it would have been a very nice settlement because every public library would have had access to every book. And it was killed because of interveners, some of whom, unfortunately, are my friends, but said, why should Google be special here? Google wasn't actually special, but nobody else was going to put up $125 million. To photographers showing up and saying, well, you haven't given us a cut. And that never went anywhere. By comparison, however, you will all remember Netflix. And you may or may not know that at one point, somebody showed up in Russia with a music sharing site called allofmp3.com, which said, we have a legitimate license to all this music in Russia. And the rest of the world was so annoyed with this that they actually got together and threatened to block Russia from the World Trade Organization unless those guys were put out of business. And they were, although they just moved to Turkey. But last year, there was a huge flood of ransomware all coming out of Russia. And I'd look and say, why can't the world do anything about this? And the answer seems to be the entertainment industry is a lot more powerful than the hospitals the ransomware people were going after. Anyway, the most interesting result of the Million Book Project, to my mind, was that Google went out and did Google Books. And for that matter, Microsoft looked at the Google Book Project and said, well, we don't understand how Google is going to make money out of this. But if they want to do it, we can do it. Now, I never understood that Google was going to make money out of it either. But I can tell you my theory just based on time. Amazon had created the search inside this book feature, which they had done by sending several 100,000 books to the Philippines, all bestsellers. And the publishers liked that because it was selling, Amazon was using it to sell books. And at the time, if any of you ever remember the Amazon search engine, because Amazon did have its own search engine once, which has completely dropped from memory. And they were advertising, well, Google only searches websites. We search books also. And Google said, okay, we're going to search books also. Now, Amazon gave up. Microsoft then replied, and Microsoft gave up. And the official Google story, as told to me by many people in Google, is no, books, it was Larry Page's childhood dream, and now he has the money to do it, so we're doing it. It is interesting that Google Books isn't driven by advertising. Microsoft, in decency, they had scanned about 750,000 books before they said, we don't see how to make money out of this. And they gave them all to the Internet Archive, which had also been scanning books. The Million Book Project had the problem. Raj, as he points out, had understood that the libraries didn't want their books destroyed. We didn't understand they weren't even willing to lend them to anybody. So Google, in the end, had to do the work on the premises of or nearby the libraries that were actually doing the scanning. And they had the advantage that the University of Michigan really wants to be nice to Google, so they'll let they scan the books in copyright. In the books that are in copyright. Now, what else is going to happen? I've been writing for a while that we're seeing a standard progression. The first time any intellectual activity starts getting computerized, people say, well, you can catalog this stuff, but the electronic version will never be a substitute for the physical version. First, it was the literary people saying, I have to have the book on paper. Then it was the art historian saying, no, I must actually go to see the original painting. Then we got to a world in which, no, people are actually willing to do their research using an online copy of whatever it is. And we're now getting to the state where people actually let the computers do the appreciation and Bob mentioned this kind of thing where you have authorship studies being done by the computers, not by the people. I now actually make a point of looking carefully for, is there anybody who has a project which really does require access to the original paper materials? Just a scanned frontispiece isn't enough. That a written frontispiece isn't enough. That could be scanned. I know Google decided to erase all of those things, but they don't need to. I know of 2 projects. Somebody dated the order of composition of Mozart's Don Giovanni by looking at the watermarks in the paper to see whether he had bought the paper in Vienna or Prague. And the other one is Project Dust Bunny at the Folger. They have 6 books. They think that Shakespeare might have actually handled that copy. And somebody is going through the books with a Q-tip, trying to get little bits of skin that flaked off the readers to see if they can get Shakespeare's DNA. This is fortunately such low probability of success. They don't have to face up to what would they do with Shakespeare's DNA if they had it. But we are getting a change. The other thing Bob mentioned is, well, we'll get newly synthesized materials. That's happened. In 1981, I had a PhD student actually from Pittsburgh whose dissertation was take the stock market tables and spit out the standard paragraph of the market closed higher today on heavy trading led by Exxon or whatever. She did quite well. People didn't usually notice that these were made. Many stories today in the newspapers are written that way, particularly the sports stories. You feed in the box score, you get the story. So we're getting this stuff. It's not, I mean, I once heard Negroponte claim that the web was such a different world that all of literature would have to be recast for it. And I put my hand up and said, Homer survived going from oral recitation to manuscript to print. You're telling me he's not going to make it onto the web? And Negroponte said, yes, that's what I'm telling you. Well, fortunately, I think Homer is still there. So what's the message? You need to be there at the right time. You need to avoid personal feuds, and you need some luck and some good technology. But I think we are seeing a world in which we will consider it as strange to do intellectual work on paper as we would now if I told you that accounting had to be done with pen and ink. Okay, thanks.